People think the worst sound an old man can hear is a doctor saying, "There's nothing more we can do." They're wrong. The worst sound is your wife's body hitting a hardwood floor, followed by laughter, not nervous laughter. Not shocked laughter, the kind that comes from someone who believes they'll never have to face the consequences of what they just did. That sound still wakes me up some nights. Even now. My name is Richard Hayes. I'm 68 years old, and for 40 years I believed that patience could solve almost anything. That night proved me wrong. Or maybe it proved that patience has limits. It happened on a Sunday evening in October. Our daughter, Melissa, insisted on hosting a family dinner at the new house she and her husband, Jason, had bought 6 months earlier. "It'll be good for everyone to spend time together," she told my wife, Margaret, over the phone. Margaret smiled the moment she hung up. "I think things are finally settling down." I hoped she was right. For nearly 2 years, something had felt different, not obvious enough to accuse anyone, not dramatic enough to explain. Just small things, pond calls that became shorter, holiday invitations that arrived later each year, conversations that stopped whenever Jason walked into the room. At first, I blamed life. People get busy, careers grow, families change. That's what I kept telling myself. Margaret believed it too. She always believed the best about people. It was one of the reasons I'd fallen in love with her 43 years earlier. She saw kindness where everyone else saw flaws. Sometimes she saw kindness that wasn't really there. By 6 o'clock we were driving toward their neighborhood. Margaret wore a navy blue dress she'd saved for special occasions. Around her neck hung the silver necklace our daughter had given her on her 50th birthday. She touched it absent-mindedly as we drove. "Do you think Melissa liked the pie? You've baked it for her every Thanksgiving since she was 12. She laughed softly. "I know, but she always says mine tastes better than anyone else's." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "You worry too much," she smiled. "I learned from you." Maybe she had, because as we turned onto Jason's street, I noticed something strange. The driveway was already full. Luxury SUVs, a black Mercedes, 2 expensive sports cars. More people than Melissa had mentioned. "You expecting a crowd?" I asked. Margaret looked puzzled. "I thought it was just family." So did I. Neither of us knew then that we had just arrived at a dinner that had never really been about family. Jason greeted us at the front door. He smiled, but his eyes didn't. "Richard." He barely shook my hand. "Margaret." He kissed the air beside her cheek without actually touching her. Everything about him looked perfect. Tailored suit, expensive watch, polished shoes, perfect hair. If confidence could be purchased, Jason had spent a fortune. "Come in," he said. "We've got a few guests." "A few?" I asked. He laughed. "Business associates." Business at a family dinner. Interesting inside. Nearly 20 people filled the house. Some stood around the kitchen island, holding wine glasses. Others gathered near the fireplace, discussing investments, commercial developments, and quarterly profits. No one looked like they'd come for homemade apple pie. Margaret leaned toward me. "I feel underlooked beautiful," she smiled. But I noticed the uncertainty in her eyes. Jason noticed it too. He simply didn't care. Melissa hurried over and hugged us. "Dad! Mom!" For a moment, everything felt normal again. Then Jason called from across the room. "Melissa." Just her name, nothing more, yet she immediately stepped away from us. "I'll be right back." She disappeared into the crowd. Margaret watched her go. "She's busy." I nodded. "Looks that way." An older gentleman introduced himself as one of Jason's investors. Another mentioned serving on the board of a manufacturing company. Within minutes, I realized almost everyone in the room had some professional connection to Jason. Only 3 people didn't. Margaret, me, and Melissa's younger brother, Ethan, who stood quietly near the back patio holding a soda instead of wine. He caught my eye. Something about his expression bothered me. He wasn't uncomfortable. He was watching Jason, watching the guests, watching us, almost as if he already knew something. and wasn't sure whether to tell us. Before I could walk over to him, Jason clapped his hands loudly. Dinner's ready. Everyone moved toward the dining room. The table had been arranged with name cards. I searched for hours. Mine sat near one end. Margaret's was on the opposite side of the table. I frowned. After 43 years of marriage, someone had intentionally seated us apart. "It must be a mistake," Margaret whispered. "Maybe, or maybe it wasn't." And for reasons I couldn't yet explain, I suddenly had the feeling that nothing about that evening had been left to chance. I always believed you can learn more about a family in 10 minutes around a dinner table than in 10 years of holiday cards. That night proved it. The dining room looked like something out of a magazine. Crystal glasses, fresh white roses, gold-trimmed plates, candles arranged with almost military precision. Everything was beautiful, almost too beautiful. The kind of beauty people create when they're trying to impress strangers instead of making family feel welcome. Margaret glanced at the place card with her name. It was between Jason's biggest investor, Charles Whitmore, and a woman named Denise, who spent the first 5 minutes explaining how difficult it was to find reliable housekeepers these days. Margaret smiled politely. She always smiled politely. I'd watched her comfort frightened cancer patients for 32 years as a pediatric nurse. She had a gift for making difficult people feel heard without encouraging their behavior. It was one of the countless things I admired about her. Jason, however, seemed determined to make sure no one noticed. Dinner began with expensive wine. Jason stood at the head of the table, holding up his glass. "I just want to thank everyone for coming." People nodded. "This has been an incredible year." More nods. "Our company closed the biggest acquisition in its history." Applause. "I couldn't have done it without the amazing people sitting around this table." More applause. I noticed something. He thanked his investors, his partners, his executive team, his mentor. Even the interior designer who had helped decorate the house. He never once mentioned Melissa, or the woman who had spent all afternoon cooking half the meal. Margaret noticed too. She simply reached for her water. As the first course was served, conversation naturally split into smaller groups. Charles leaned toward Margaret. "So, Mrs. Hayes, what did your husband do before retirement?" Margaret smiled proudly. "Richard spent nearly 40 years with the State Office of Workplace Safety." Charles looked interested. "Oh, he investigated industrial accidents." Margaret continued. "Eventually he became regional director." I almost interrupted her. Titles had never mattered much to me. The work did, making sure fathers came home alive, making sure companies didn't cut corners that got people killed. That's what mattered. Charles nodded respectfully. "Tough career." It was. Before I could say another word, Jason laughed from across the table. "My father-in-law still thinks paperwork can fix the world." Several guests chuckled politely. I smiled. "It helped save quite a few lives." Jason shrugged. "I'm just saying things work differently in business." His tone sounded light. His eyes didn't. Charles looked uncomfortable. He changed the subject. But something had shifted, almost too subtly to notice. Jason wasn't insulting me directly. He was testing the room, seeing who would laugh, who would stay quiet, who would follow his lead. Halfway through dinner, Melissa carried out Margaret's homemade apple pie, the entire dining room filled with the smell of cinnamon and butter. Margaret looked almost embarrassed by the attention. "I hope everyone likes it." Charles took one bite. "This is incredible," Denise agreed. "So much better than restaurant desserts." Even Jason's business partners began asking for the recipe. For the first time that evening, Margaret relaxed. Her shoulders dropped. Her smile became genuine. Then Jason ruined it. He laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Careful." He pointed toward the pie. "If Richard finds out everyone likes Margaret's cooking more than his retirement stories, he'll get jealous." More laughter. Not because it was funny. Because people in expensive suits often laugh at whoever signs the biggest checks. Margaret forced another smile. I didn't. Something strange happened after dessert. Jason suggested everyone move into the living room for coffee. As people stood, I noticed Ethan again. Instead of joining everyone else, he walked quickly toward me. "Dad." His voice was barely above a whisper. "What is it?" He glanced over his shoulder. "Just stay close to Mom." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, Jason called his name. "Ethan." He froze. "I'm coming." He looked back at me one last time. There was fear in his eyes. Real fear. Then he walked away. Margaret joined me. What was that about? I don't know. But I intended to find out. The living room overlooked a beautifully landscaped backyard. Guests gathered in small circles discussing markets, politics, and investment opportunities. Margaret carried a coffee cup toward the large windows. She loved gardens. Within seconds, she was complimenting Melissa on the roses she'd planted. For a brief moment, she looked happy again. I watched from across the room while speaking with Charles. Something caught my attention. Jason. He had been standing near the hallway watching Margaret, not casually, intently. His expression wasn't angry, it was calculated. Then he picked up his drink and began walking toward her, slowly, almost casually. I excused myself from Charles. Something in my stomach tightened. I couldn't explain why. Years of investigations had taught me to trust that feeling. Most accidents aren't really accidents. Usually, someone ignores a warning before something terrible happens. I started walking toward Margaret. 20 feet away. 15, 10. Jason reached her first. He smiled. Said something I couldn't hear. Margaret laughed politely. She turned slightly toward the garden. And then it happened. Jason shifted his right foot. Just enough. Not dramatically. Just enough. Margaret stepped backward. Her heel caught his shoe. Her balance disappeared instantly. The coffee cup flew from her hand. It shattered against the hardwood floor. Then came the sound. Her body hit the ground with a sickening crack. For one horrifying second, no one moved. Then, someone laughed. Another joined in. Jason raised both hands dramatically. "Oh no," he chuckled. "I guess we found out who's had too much coffee." More laughter. My heart stopped, because Margaret wasn't getting up. She wasn't moving at all. I dropped to my knees beside her. "Margaret." Her face had gone pale. One hand clutched her hip, the other trembled uncontrollably. She looked at me, trying to smile through the pain. "I'm okay." But after 43 years together, I knew exactly when she was lying to protect someone else. And something else caught my eye. Out of the corner of the room, Ethan wasn't looking at his mother. He was staring directly at Jason with absolute disbelief. As if he'd just witnessed something he prayed no one else had seen. For a few seconds, the room forgot about the investors, the conversations, the expensive wine, the image Jason had spent years creating. All anyone could see was my wife lying on the hardwood floor. "Don't move," I whispered. Margaret tried to sit up. The moment she shifted her weight, her face twisted in pain. "Oh," she grabbed my arm so tightly I could feel her nails through my jacket. "It's my hip." I looked at Melissa. "Call an ambulance." She stood frozen. Jason answered instead. "Let's not overreact." Every head in the room turned toward him. "It's probably just a bruise." I looked up slowly. His expression irritated me more than his words. He wasn't worried. He was annoyed. Annoyed that dinner had been interrupted. Before I could respond, Charles Whitmore knelt beside me. "I'm calling 911. Jason sighed loudly. "Charles, this is unnecessary." Charles ignored him. Within seconds, he was speaking calmly to the dispatcher. As he described Margaret's condition, I noticed Jason scanning the room, not looking at Margaret, looking at the guests, judging their reactions, managing the damage. That was the first moment I stopped believing it had been an accident. The ambulance arrived 9 minutes later. 9 very long minutes. A paramedic examined Margaret carefully before asking a simple question. "Ma'am, did you trip over something?" Margaret looked confused. She closed her eyes. "It happened so fast," Jason answered before she could continue. "She lost her balance." The paramedic nodded while writing notes. I said nothing. Not yet. Years of investigations had taught me something important. The first version of a story is usually the one people rehearse. The truth needs time. At the hospital, we waited nearly 2 hours. Melissa stayed beside her mother. Jason paced the hallway making phone calls. I watched him through the glass doors. His voice stayed low. His gestures grew more animated with every call. Once, he looked directly toward me, then immediately turned away, almost as if he were afraid I'd read his lips. Interesting, very interesting. Around midnight, the orthopedic surgeon finally walked into the waiting room. "Mr. Hayes?" I stood. "Your wife has a fractured pelvis." My stomach tightened. "It'll heal," he quickly added. "But at her age," he paused carefully, "recovery will take several months." Several months. Margaret loved gardening, morning walks, volunteering at the children's hospital. She'd spent her entire retirement helping other people. Now she would struggle just to climb stairs. I thanked the doctor, but inside, something had already begun changing. The next morning I returned to Melissa's house, not because I wanted to, because Margaret's purse had been left behind. Jason answered the door. He looked surprised. "I thought you'd be at the hospital. I came for Margaret's things." He nodded stiffly. "There in the kitchen." Neither of us spoke while I collected her purse and coat as I reached the hallway. I noticed something. The broken coffee cup had been cleaned up. The rug had been replaced. Even the furniture had been moved slightly, almost as though someone wanted the room to look untouched, too untouched. "Quick cleanup," I said casually. Jason shrugged. The cleaning crew came early. Cleaning crew at 7 in the morning, after a family emergency. Interesting, very interesting. As I reached the front door, Ethan's truck pulled into the driveway. He climbed out quickly. The moment he saw me, relief flashed across his face. "Dad, morning." Jason interrupted immediately. "Ethan, can you help me in the garage?" "No." The answer came faster than any of us expected. Jason stared at him. "What?" "I need to talk to Dad." Jason forced a smile. "It can wait." "No," Ethan repeated. "It can't." For several seconds, neither man moved. Then Jason quietly walked back inside the house. He didn't slam the door. He didn't argue. He simply disappeared. That bothered me more than if he had yelled. Ethan waited until Jason's car left the driveway 20 minutes later. Only then did he finally speak. "Dad," his voice shook. "I don't think Mom fell. I felt every muscle in my body tense." "What are you saying?" I saw Jason. "Saw what?" He stuck his foot out. The words hung in the air. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure at first. Ethan continued, but he swallowed hard after everyone laughed. His eyes filled with tears. He looked at me. Not at Mom, at me, as if he wanted to know whether I'd noticed. I placed one hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Why didn't you say something last night?" He looked away. "Melissa." "What about her?" "I didn't want to destroy her marriage if I wasn't absolutely certain." I understood family makes witnesses hesitate, love clouds certainty, fear silences truth. I'd seen it hundreds of times during my career. "There's something else." Ethan reached into his pocket. I almost forgot. He handed me a small black object. At first, I didn't recognize it. Then I turned it over. A luxury car key fob, Jason's. "It fell out of his pocket?" Ethan nodded. "No, I found it under the hallway table." So I watched the security recording this morning. I looked at him. "What security recording?" "The indoor camera." My heart skipped. "There was a camera?" Ethan nodded slowly. Jason installed smart security cameras in every common room after the burglary next door. Every common room, including the living room, the exact place where Margaret had fallen. I stared at him. Neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered. "Does the footage still exist?" Ethan looked down. His answer came almost as a whisper. "It did." He paused. "Until 3 o'clock this morning, a cold chill ran through my body. What happened at 3 o'clock? Ethan looked directly into my eyes. Someone remotely deleted every recording from last night. And in that moment, I realized Something far more dangerous than a man who trips an elderly woman. I was dealing with someone who already understood the value of destroying evidence. I didn't answer Ethan immediately. I simply stared at him. 40 years of accident investigations had taught me one lesson that never failed. People destroy evidence for only one of two reasons. Either they know they're guilty, or they're terrified someone else will discover what they're already hiding. I had a feeling Jason fit both categories. "Tell me everything," I said quietly. Ethan took a long breath. "The cameras save recordings to the cloud." I nodded. "That's standard." I logged into Melissa's account because she asked me to check whether the front porch package had been delivered. "When?" "This morning." "And the recording from last night was gone." "Only last night." He nodded. Every other day was still there: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, even recordings from 6 months ago. Only one date: Sunday, the night Margaret fell, had vanished. I looked toward Jason's house. The curtains were closed. His black BMW was gone. Who else knows about the cameras? Melissa. And Jason. That's it. Interesting. Very interesting. Jason hadn't deleted months of recordings, only the one that mattered. That wasn't panic. That was precision. Did Melissa notice? Ethan shook his head. "She hasn't checked." "And you didn't tell her?" "I wanted to tell you first." I put my hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing." He looked relieved. Then his expression darkened again. "Dad, what?" "I don't think this started yesterday." "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated. "I've seen Jason do little things before." "Like what?" He looked embarrassed. "I wasn't sure they mattered." "They matter now, the first time." He looked down at the driveway. "Was last Christmas." I stayed silent. He moved Grandma's walker. "What?" "Just a few inches." "So she'd have trouble reaching it." My jaw tightened. "I thought it was an accident." "What happened?" Grandma almost fell. Margaret had laughed it off. She'd blamed herself. I must be getting clumsy. I remembered those exact words. God. She'd apologized for something someone else had done. Then there was Easter. What happened? He loosened one of the patio chairs. I frowned. "Are you certain?" I watched him. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because." Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. He tightened it again before anyone sat down. "So nothing happened?" He nodded. I convinced myself I imagined it. I didn't interrupt. Witnesses often doubt themselves, especially when the person they're accusing wears expensive suits and charming smiles. There were other things too, such as... He'd make little comments. "Careful, Margaret. You're not as young as you used to be." Maybe Richard should start looking at retirement communities, always laughing afterward, always saying, "I'm just kidding." I felt something cold settle inside me. Bullying rarely begins with violence. It begins with testing boundaries, finding out what people will excuse. Yesterday, Jason discovered everyone had been willing to excuse far too much. That afternoon, I returned to the hospital. Margaret was sitting beside the window when I walked in. Sunlight warmed the blanket covering her legs. She smiled the moment she saw me. "You're back. I brought your favorite tea." She laughed softly. "Hospital coffee finally scared you away?" "It nearly killed me." She smiled again. Seeing her smile, even after everything, reminded me why I had to stay calm. Anger makes mistakes. Patience finds truth. She looked toward the window. "Sore, I imagine." And embarrassed. I pulled my chair closer. Embarrassed. I ruined Melissa's dinner. For a second, I couldn't believe what I'd heard. "You ruined." I stopped myself. Margaret nodded. "Everyone worked so hard." I reached for her hand. "You didn't ruin anything." She smiled sadly. "I've become clumsy." "No, I have." "You've said that before." She looked surprised. "When?" "Christmas." She frowned, then something changed. Not dramatically, just enough. She closed her eyes. "I remember something." I leaned forward. "What?" "When Jason spoke to me, what did he say?" Her forehead tightened. "He asked if I'd seen the new roses, and..." I turned. She demonstrated slightly with her hand to look outside. Then she stopped speaking. What happened next? I felt. She searched for the memory. Pressure. Behind my ankle. Not in front, not beside. Behind, exactly where someone's foot would have been. She opened her eyes. I thought, what? I thought maybe I'd imagined it. I didn't answer, not because I doubted her, because memories after trauma arrive like broken pieces of glass. You don't force them together, you wait. That evening I sat alone in my study. On the bookshelf behind me sat dozens of old investigation binders from my career. Industrial explosions, cocked cranes, fought fires. Every one of them had started with someone saying the same sentence. It was just an accident. Most weren't. People simply preferred accidents. Accidents don't require blame. Truth does. My phone buzzed unknown number. Normally, I ignored unknown calls. Something told me not to. Richard silenced then. A woman spoke quietly. Mr. Hayes? Yes. My name is Olivia. Her voice trembled. I work for Jason. I sat up straighter. How did you get this number? I shouldn't be calling. Then why are you? Another long silence. Finally, she whispered. Because what happened to your wife? She took a shaky breath. Isn't the first time Jason has hurt someone. Every instinct I had sharpened instantly. Explain. I can't over the phone. Why not? Because if he's monitoring company records, she stopped herself. Monitoring records? Company records? That wasn't what I asked. Interesting. Very interesting. I think you're investigating the wrong thing. I felt my pulse quicken. What do you mean? The fall, she whispered, was only the beginning. Before I could ask another question, the line went dead. I called back immediately. The number no longer existed, not disconnected, not unavailable, simply gone. I lowered the phone slowly. For the first time since Margaret had fallen, I stopped believing this story was only about my family. Somewhere, hidden beneath one cruel act at a family dinner, was something much larger, and Jason was desperate to make sure no one uncovered it. I spent most of that night staring at my phone, not because I expected Olivia to call again, because I couldn't stop replaying the last sentence she said. The fall was only the beginning. It didn't sound like someone trying to help. It sounded like someone trying to warn me. There was a difference. Warnings come from people who know something is already in motion. I had heard that tone before, years earlier, during an investigation at a chemical plant. A young engineer had quietly told me, "You should inspect the West storage tanks first." He wouldn't explain why. 3 days later, we discovered the company had been hiding dangerous corrosion reports for almost 2 years. That engineer hadn't been guessing, he'd been terrified. Olivia's voice carried that same fear. At 6:30 the next morning, I was already sitting on my back porch with a notebook. People often assume investigations begin with dramatic discoveries. They don't. They begin with ordinary questions. I wrote a single name at the top of the page, Jason Cole. Below it, I drew 2 columns: what I know, what I don't know. The left side filled surprisingly fast. He had deliberately moved his foot. The security footage had been deleted. He'd shown no concern after Margaret fell. He'd minimized her injuries. He'd been making subtle comments about her age for months. Someone inside his company was afraid enough to contact me. Then I looked at the right side. It was much longer. Why? Why Margaret? Why now? What was Olivia trying to tell me? And perhaps the biggest question of all, what kind of man risks everything over something that, on the surface, looked like a cruel joke? People don't usually destroy evidence over a prank, unless the prank wasn't the real crime. At 9 o'clock, Daniel Foster called. "I've been thinking about your situation." "So have I. I did something this morning." "What?" "I checked public court records." I frowned. "For Jason?" "Yes, and there are no criminal cases." I wasn't surprised. Jason was too careful. "But," Daniel continued, "there are 3 sealed civil settlements involving companies where he held executive positions." That got my attention. "Sealed?" "Yes. So the details aren't public." "Correct. Can you see the allegations?" "No, but I can see one interesting pattern." "What pattern?" Every settlement happened shortly after an internal employee complaint. I'd back in my chair. What kind of complaint? I don't know. The files are sealed. 3 settlements, different companies. Same pattern. Coincidence? Maybe. I stopped believing in coincidences decades ago. Before hanging up, Daniel asked a question that caught me off guard. Richard? Yes?
Did Jason ever ask you about your old job?
I thought for a moment. Several times. What did he ask? He seemed curious about how investigations worked. Daniel was silent. Then he asked, "Did he ever ask how evidence disappears?" I froze, because suddenly I remembered almost a year earlier. Jason and I had been standing beside his grill during a 4th of July barbecue. He'd poured us both a drink. Then, almost casually, he'd asked, "When you investigated accidents, how often did companies erase records before you arrived?" At the time, I'd laughed. "More often than you'd think." Jason smiled. "Did it ever help them?" I remembered my answer perfectly. No, because people who destroy evidence usually leave behind something even more valuable. At the time, he'd simply nodded. Now, that conversation felt very different. Around lunchtime, Ethan stopped by my house. He carried a cardboard box. "What's this?" I cleaned out Mum's car. Inside were Margaret's reading glasses, her knitting bag, a half-finished crossword puzzle, and the apple pie dish she'd baked for Sunday dinner. Still wrapped in a kitchen towel, Margaret had spent hours making that pie. Jason had laughed 5 minutes after she served it. I closed the box. "What else?" Ethan hesitated. There was something in the trunk. He handed me a folded envelope. No stamp, no address. Just one handwritten word. Margaret looked at him. "Have you opened it?" He shook his head. It was tucked under the emergency tire cover. That's strange. I thought so too. The envelope had obviously been placed there intentionally, not mailed. Hi. I carefully unfolded the paper inside. There was only one sentence. "Be careful who you trust around Jason." No signature, no explanation. Nothing else. The handwriting wasn't familiar. Whoever wrote it wanted Margaret to find it, but not immediately. Why? Ethan watched my expression. "What is it?" I handed him the note. His eyes widened. "Who wrote this?" "I don't know." "When was it put there?" "I don't know that either." He turned the paper over. Nothing, no fingerprints visible, no company logo, plain white stationery. Whoever wrote it had planned this carefully. Too carefully. That afternoon I visited Margaret again. She looked stronger, still in pain. But stronger. The physical therapist had already helped her stand with a walker. She hated every second of it. "I feel 90, you look 60. She rolled her eyes. "Liar." I laughed. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things, the garden, the weather. Our grandson's baseball game next weekend. Neither of us mentioned Jason. Eventually, she looked at me. "You've been awfully quiet." "I've been thinking about him." It wasn't a question. I nodded. She sighed. "Richard." "What?" "Don't let this consume you." I reached for her hand. "It already has." She looked down. "I don't want to lose you too." Those words hit harder than anything else she'd said, because she knew me. She knew what happened whenever I believed someone innocent had been harmed. Retirement hadn't changed that part of me. As I left the hospital, my phone vibrated again. Number. The same feeling returned immediately. I answered. "Richard Hayes." This time, a man's voice, low, careful. "Stop asking questions." I didn't respond. "You don't understand who you're dealing with." "Who is this?" Another pause. Then, "You should be grateful your wife survived." The line went dead. I stood completely still in the hospital parking lot. Not because of the threat, because of one word. Survived. Not, "She'll recover." Not, "It was an accident." Survived. That wasn't the language of someone describing a mistake. That was the language of someone who already knew exactly how dangerous Jason could be. I slowly slipped the phone back into my pocket. The wind carried the smell of rain across the parking lot for the first time since Sunday. I realized something that made every previous clue feel much smaller. I wasn't investigating a family conflict anymore. Someone out there was trying to keep me alive long enough to uncover the truth. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of the phone call, because of the word, survived. People choose their words carefully when they're afraid. Whoever had called me hadn't warned me about Jason's temper. He'd warned me about his capacity. There was a difference, a dangerous one. At 7 the next morning, I received another call. This one wasn't from an unknown number. It was Charles Whitmore, the investor who had sat beside Margaret during dinner. Richard, his voice sounded heavier than usual. I've been thinking about Sunday, so have I. There are a few things I didn't tell the police. I frowned. What kind of things? I'd rather tell you in person. Where? The old Riverside Cafe. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Charles was already waiting when I arrived. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. His untouched coffee had gone cold. I owe you an apology. For what? I should have spoken up that night. I sat across from him. What did you see? He took a deep breath. I didn't actually see Jason move his foot. I felt my shoulders relax slightly. But, he continued, I saw something almost as important. What? His face. I waited. When your wife fell, Charles swallowed. Everyone else looked shocked. But Jason, he paused, smiled. I didn't interrupt. It only lasted a second. But I've spent 40 years negotiating billion-dollar contracts. I've learned to read faces. That wasn't surprise. It wasn't panic. It was satisfaction. Those words settled heavily between us. Charles reached into his briefcase. I almost threw this away. He handed me a folded dinner program, the guest list. So turn it over. I did. On the back, someone had written a seating chart by hand, not the final one. The original one, Margaret and I had been seated together. I looked up. What is this? I picked it up after dinner. Who changed it? I don't know. But someone rearranged the seating assignments less than an hour before everyone arrived. My mind immediately started working. If Margaret had remained beside me, she never would have been standing alone by that window. Jason would have lost his opportunity. This wasn't spontaneous. Someone had planned where everyone would be. There's something else. Charles leaned forward. Jason kept asking where you were. What do you mean? Every 15 or 20 minutes. Where's Richard? Is Richard still outside? Has Richard seen the garden yet? At first, it sounded harmless. Then Charles said something that made every piece fall into place. I think. He lowered his voice. He was making sure you weren't looking. I drove away from the cafe with more questions than answers. But one thing had become clear. The dinner hadn't been random. The seating wasn't random. The conversations weren't random. Even separating Margaret and me hadn't been random. Someone had spent hours arranging the evening. Why? To embarrass her? To hurt her? Or was she simply the easiest target? That afternoon, Olivia called again, this time from another number. I only have a minute. I'm listening. You asked the wrong question. What? You keep asking why Jason hurt your wife. She stopped. That's not the question. What is? Ask yourself, she whispered. What? Jason was trying to stop. My heart skipped. Stop! Your wife wasn't the objective. I stood up so quickly my chair tipped backward. What are you talking about? Your wife interrupted something. What? I can't explain over the phone. You have to know. Her breathing became faster. They're watching. They? She ignored the question. Go to Harbor Point Construction. I frowned. The company. Look at the accident from 18 months ago. I don't understand. You will. Before hanging up, she added one final sentence. Your old job wasn't a coincidence. The line went dead. Harbor Point Construction. The name sounded familiar. Too familiar. I walked into my study and unlocked an old metal filing cabinet. Inside were dozens of retirement boxes I'd never bothered to unpack. Old notebooks, inspection reports, photographs, case summaries. It took nearly an hour before I found the binder I was looking for. Harbor Point Construction, crane collapse investigation 18 months earlier. My final major consultation before retirement. I opened the file. The photographs came first. A collapsed tower crane, twisted steel, concrete debris, 3 injured workers, 1 dead. Then I reached the witness statements.
The company executive who had represented Harbour Point during the investigation. I froze. My eyes returned to the page. I read the name again.
Jason Cole, no. That couldn't be right. I flipped through more pages. Meeting attendance, executive signatures, I'm correspondence. There it was again. Jason Cole. Vice President of Operations. My stomach tightened. I'd met him before, not socially, professionally, years before he married my daughter. How had I forgotten? Then I remembered he'd grown a beard, lost weight, changed hairstyles. Enough to make the face familiar, but not unforgettable. I kept reading. Near the end of the report, 1 paragraph had been highlighted in yellow. It was my own handwriting. Executive refused to provide complete maintenance records. Recommended follow-up audit if additional evidence emerges. I stared at those words. I had written them, then retired 2 months later. The follow-up investigation had never happened. A cold chill ran down my spine. Jason had known exactly who I was, long before he ever met Melissa. He hadn't fallen in love with my daughter first. He'd met me first, and suddenly, an impossible question entered my mind. Had Jason chosen my daughter because of me? I looked at the family wedding photo hanging on my wall. Jason's smile, Melissa's happiness, Margaret's proud eyes. For the first time, that photograph didn't look like a family memory. It looked like the beginning of a plan. I must have read Jason's name 20 times. Each time, I hoped I'd missed something, a typo, a different Jason Cole, some harmless coincidence. But the signature matched. The employee identification number matched. Even the email address, it was him. My son-in-law had stood across a conference table from me almost 2 years before he ever introduced himself to Melissa. And somehow, he'd never mentioned it. Neither had I. Life has a strange way of hiding familiar faces until the moment they matter. I closed the binder, then opened it again. 1 page in particular caught my attention. The attendance sheet from the final safety meeting. 9 executives had signed. 8 signatures looked ordinary. The 9th, Jason's, was written so hard the pen had nearly torn through the paper. People reveal more about themselves than they realize. Pressure, anger control, it all shows up somewhere. I drove to the hospital without calling anyone. Margaret was asleep. For a few minutes, I simply sat beside her bed, watching her breathe, watching the heart monitor rise and fall. 43 years, thousands of ordinary mornings, thousands of ordinary evenings. Never once had I imagined someone would deliberately hurt the woman who had spent her entire life helping others. She opened her eyes slowly. "Richard, I'm here." She smiled weakly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile. "Maybe I have." She reached for my hand. "You found something." It wasn't a question. After 4 decades together, she could read me better than anyone. "I found an old investigation." "About Jason?" I nodded. She stayed quiet. Then she surprised me. "I always thought he recognized you." I stared at her. "What?" "The first time he came to our house, when he and Melissa started dating, he kept looking at you. I assumed he was nervous." She frowned. "But now," she looked away, "I'm not so sure." Another piece, another clue, another memory that suddenly meant something completely different. Before I could tell her anything else, there was a knock at the door. Melissa walked in carrying fresh flowers. She stopped when she saw me. "Dad, Melissa." For a second, neither of us moved. The distance between us wasn't measured in feet anymore. It was measured in trust. She placed the flowers beside the bed. "Mom." Margaret smiled warmly. "My beautiful girl." Melissa sat down. She looked exhausted. Dark circles surrounded her eyes. She hadn't been sleeping either. Finally, she spoke. "Jason says everyone is blaming him." I didn't answer. "He says it was an accident." Still, nothing. She looked directly at me. "Do you believe him?" I held her gaze. No, 1 word, no anger, no raised voice, just the truth, her eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to believe anymore. Neither did I, at least, not yet that evening. I received another unexpected visitor, Daniel Foster. He carried a thick manila folder. "I've been busy." He placed it on my kitchen table. "What's this?" I had a favor called in. Daniel had spent 35 years practicing law. People owed him favors, serious favors. He opened the folder. "Jason has changed companies 4 times in 11 years. That's unusual." "Very." He slid another page toward me. "Average stay? Less than 3 years. Promotion? No. Resignation. Every time." I looked through the employment timeline. Company A 3 years, resigned company B 2 years, resigned company C 2.5 years, resigned Harbour Point, resigned current employer, just over 18 months. Something wasn't right. Successful executives don't keep walking away from increasingly prestigious positions. Unless they're leaving before something catches up to them. Daniel pulled out one final document. This one bothered me. It was a copy of a corporate ethics complaint. Most of the page had been heavily redacted. Only a few sentences remained visible. Hostile work environment, intimidation of employees, fear of retaliation. The complainant's name had been blacked out, so had the outcome. What happened? Daniel shook his head. The file disappeared, as if it never existed. I looked up. Can someone do that? Not legally. Silence settled across the room. Then Daniel quietly asked, "Richard, yes, how many times in your career did you investigate someone who destroyed records?" I didn't have to think. "Too many. And how many of them were innocent?" I met his eyes. At 8:15 my phone buzzed again. A text message, unknown number, only an address. 1478 Mason Industrial Park, no explanation. No name, no message, just an address. A second text arrived 10 seconds later. "Tomorrow alone, if you want the truth." Daniel read the screen. "I don't like this. Neither do I. It could be a trap. It could." He looked at me carefully. "Are you going?" I stared at the address. Every instinct told me not to. Every instinct I'd developed over 40 years told me something else. People don't risk contacting strangers unless they're desperate. Olivia had risked everything. The anonymous caller had warned me. Someone had hidden a note in Margaret's car. Now, someone wanted to meet. Too many frightened people were pointing toward the same man. I slipped the phone into my pocket. "I'm going," Daniel sighed. "I figured you'd say that." He stood up. Then, "Promise me one thing." "What?" "If anything feels wrong." He paused. "Walk away." I nodded. "I will." But deep inside, I already knew. Tomorrow wasn't going to answer one question. It was going to change the entire story. And I had a feeling Jason already knew I was getting closer. The next morning, I left my house at exactly 9:15. I didn't tell Margaret where I was going. If she knew, she'd try to stop me. Not because she didn't want the truth. Because she still believed people were basically good, even after everything Jason had done. I envied that about her. I really did. Mason Industrial Park sat on the edge of the city. Most of the warehouses had been converted into office space years ago. The address led me to an old brick building with faded numbers above the entrance. No company logo, no reception desk, just a small cafe occupying the corner unit. Whoever chose this place had done so carefully. Plenty of people, plenty of security cameras, easy exits, hard to disappear without being noticed. I walked inside. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room. About 20 people sat scattered around the cafe. Construction workers, college students, a young mother with a stroller. No one looked at me twice. Then, a woman stood from the far corner, early 30s, dark hair tied back, nervous eyes. She wasn't dressed like an executive. Sybil jeans, grey sweater, no makeup. She looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. She approached slowly. I nodded. "Olivia." She looked relieved. "You actually came." "You asked me to." She glanced around the cafe. "Can we sit?" For almost a full minute, neither of us spoke. She wrapped both hands around a cup of coffee she never drank. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry about your wife." "Thank you. I should have warned someone sooner." "You knew Jason?" A bitter smile crossed her face. I knew the version everyone else never sees. I stayed silent. People tell the truth when they don't feel interrupted. I've worked under Jason for almost 3 years. She looked toward the window. The first 6 months were wonderful. He was charming, confident, supportive. Everyone admired him. She laughed quietly. Then people started disagreeing with him. Her smile disappeared. And that's when the real Jason showed up. He never screamed, she continued. He never threatened anyone in public. He was smarter than that. What did he do? He destroyed people. She looked directly at me without ever raising his voice. I didn't say anything, because I'd met men like that before. The calm ones, the ones who smiled while ruining someone's career. The dangerous ones rarely lost control. They simply made everyone else lose theirs. Olivia reached into her handbag. I've carried this for 8 months. She placed a small flash drive on the table. I didn't touch it. What's on it? Documents. What kind? Emails, financial reports, internal complaints, derided meeting notes. My eyes narrowed. She nodded. Jason thought he'd erased them. How do you have them? I work in compliance. Interesting, very interesting. Compliance departments don't usually make enemies, unless someone wants them to ignore violations. Why give this to me? She laughed sadly. Because no one believes employees. But they believe you. Why? Because... She hesitated. Jason's terrified of you. That surprised me. Terrified? She nodded. I heard him say it. When? The Monday after your wife fell. She closed her eyes, remembering. He walked into the executive conference room and said, she swallowed. If Richard Hayes starts digging, we're all finished. The words hit me like a hammer. Not, if he finds out I tripped his wife. Not, if he sues. No, if he starts digging. Digging into what? Who are we? Olivia looked around the cafe again. They've been hiding workplace accidents. I felt my pulse quicken. Explain. For years, she lowered her voice. The company has been quietly settling injury claims, without reporting them illegal, completely. How many? I don't know, but more than anyone realizes. I suddenly remembered Harbor Point, the missing maintenance records, the deleted files, the sealed settlements. It wasn't one company. It was a pattern. Jason kept changing employers. But somehow, the same problems followed him, almost as though he wasn't escaping scandals. He was taking them with him. Olivia opened her phone. There was one accident, she whispered. A maintenance supervisor. He refused to sign a false inspection report. What happened? 3 weeks later, he was fired for misconduct. I frowned. Was it misconduct? She shook her head. He'd refused to lie. She slid another envelope across the table. This belongs to you. Was a printed email from Jason sent 18 months earlier. The subject line read, Richard Hayes. I stopped breathing. Why would Jason email someone about me before he even married Melissa? I began reading. Former regional director Richard Hayes has retired. No further review is expected. Close remaining documentation accordingly. I looked up slowly. When was this sent? The week after you retired. A cold wave washed over me. Jason hadn't simply recognized me. He had celebrated my retirement. Because I'd been the one person still asking uncomfortable questions. Then Olivia said something that changed everything. Meeting Melissa. She hesitated. Was an accident. I stared at her. What? They met at a charity fundraiser. I know, she nodded. That part was real. But once Jason realized who her father was, she looked down. He never intended to let her go. My hands tightened around the email. You're telling me? She nodded before I could finish. He saw your daughter as protection. Silence, Dommel, silence. 43 years of protecting my family. Countless sacrifices. Every lesson I'd tried to teach my children. And somehow, a man had looked at my daughter, not with love, but as a shield that made him believe no one would ever suspect him. Olivia stood up suddenly. I have to go. Wait. There's one last thing. She looked frightened now, genuinely frightened. They know these files are missing. Who? She whispered only 2 words. The board. Before I could ask another question, a black SUV stopped outside the cafe. Olivia's face turned white. They found me. She grabbed her bag. Don't trust anyone until you know who's involved. Then she rushed through the back exit. Seconds later, 2 men in dark suits walked into the cafe. They weren't looking at the customers. They were looking for her. One of them glanced toward my table. Our eyes met for only a second, but it was enough. He recognized me. He reached into his jacket, not for a weapon. For a phone, he turned away and spoke quietly into it. I couldn't hear the words. I didn't need to, because whatever happened next, Jason now knew that I had the evidence.
And for the first time, I wasn't sure whether he wanted to protect his career or protect something far more dangerous. I didn't run.
I didn't hide the flash drive. And I certainly didn't panic. If 40 years in government investigations had taught me anything, it was this. The moment guilty people realize you've found the truth, they stop making careful decisions. They start making desperate ones. Desperate people leave evidence. I quietly placed the flash drive into the inside pocket of my jacket, finished the last sip of my coffee, and walked out of the cafe through the front entrance. The 2 men in dark suits watched me. Neither approached, neither spoke. One simply held his phone to his ear while staring directly at me. Perfect. I wanted them to know exactly who had the evidence. I drove home without taking the direct route, not because I thought someone was following me, because I wanted time to think. Every clue from the past week began fitting together. Jason hadn't panicked because of Margaret. He panicked because I had started asking questions. Margaret's fall had been his biggest mistake. It forced me to do the one thing he'd spent years trying to avoid: investigate him. When I pulled into my driveway, I didn't even go inside. Instead, I sat in my truck, looked at my phone, and scrolled until I found a name I hadn't called in almost 4 years. David Reynolds, current regional director of the State Office of Workplace Safety. Years ago, he'd been my deputy. Today, he held the position I'd retired from. I stared at his name for nearly a minute. This was the call. The one call. The call that would change everything. Not because David would destroy Jason. Because David believed in something Jason never understood. Facts. I pressed call. Richard, David answered on the second ring. His voice sounded exactly the same. Calm, professional. Been a long time. It has. How's retirement treating you? I wish that was why I was calling. His tone changed immediately. What's wrong? My wife was seriously injured. I'm sorry. I believe it wasn't an accident. Silence. Then, what do you need? I need you to remember Harbor Point construction. Another pause. I remember. So do I. You were never comfortable closing that file. No, I wasn't. David sighed. I wasn't either. Those words confirmed something I'd suspected for years. What happened after I retired? He hesitated. Was cancelled. Budget cuts. I almost laughed. No, it wasn't. David didn't answer. Sometimes silence is an answer. I have evidence, I finally said. What kind? Evidence that Jason Cole concealed safety records. David didn't interrupt. I also have documents suggesting the same pattern continued after Harbor Point. Still, silence then. Can you prove it? I think so. I don't need think, Richard. I need documents. I smiled for the first time in days. They're sitting in my jacket pocket. David didn't hesitate. Bring everything? When now? 2 hours later, I walked through the same government building I'd entered thousands of times during my career. The security guard looked up, then smiled. Mr. Hayes? I laughed. It's been a while. Good to see you back. Funny. Some places never really leave you. David was waiting outside the conference room. He hugged me before saying a single word. Then his eyes grew serious. I heard about Margaret. She's recovering. Good. He looked at the flash drive in my hand. Let's see what you've got. The conference room slowly filled with investigators. Not politicians, not lawyers, investigators. The kind of people who cared about evidence more than opinions. Exactly my kind of people. Olivia hadn't exaggerated. The flash drive contained thousands of files, inspection reports, internal emails, deleted maintenance logs, audio recordings from executive meetings. One email immediately caught David's attention. He opened it on the projector. Jason had written, "Delay reporting until after the quarterly audit. We'll adjust the incident classification later." No ambiguity, no misunderstanding, no innocent explanation. A younger investigator looked up. That's felony territory. Another opened a spreadsheet. "There are injury reports missing from the federal database." Someone else compared dates. "The maintenance logs don't match." Another voice from the end of the room. "This signature was digitally altered." The room grew quieter with every discovery. Nobody needed to speculate anymore. The evidence spoke for itself. David leaned back in his chair. "When did you get all this?" "This morning. And the woman who gave it to you?" "She's frightened. Can you protect her?" "I don't know." David nodded. "We can." He looked around the room. "No one contacts Jason. No one contacts his company. No one leaks anything." "Understood." Every investigator nodded. This wasn't going to be a media circus. It was going to be a legal investigation. Exactly as it should be. David closed the laptop, then looked directly at me. "You know what happens next." "I do. We'll execute search warrants, interview employees, secure the servers, freeze document destruction." I nodded. He continued. "And Richard? Yes? This isn't your investigation anymore." I smiled. "But thank you." He shook his head. "No." He looked toward the evidence. "Thank you." At exactly 4:17 p.m., David signed the authorization packet, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with professionalism. One signature, one official order, one legal phone call to the enforcement division. Within minutes, state investigators, federal workplace safety officers, and financial crimes analysts all received the same instruction: proceed. That was the phone call Jason never saw coming, not because it came from me, because it came from the law. At 6:42 p.m., Jason was finishing an executive board meeting. He smiled as he walked toward the elevators. His assistant later told investigators he looked completely relaxed. Then the elevator doors opened, not to another executive, to 6 investigators wearing government credentials. "Jason Cole?" He smiled politely. "Yes." One investigator handed him an official notice. "We're executing a warrant." His smile disappeared. "I'm sorry?" Another investigator stepped forward. "Your office is now secured. No documents are to be removed. No electronic devices are to leave this floor." Jason looked around. Half the executive team had stopped walking. Employees stared through the glass walls. One whispered, "What's happening?" Another answered, "I don't know." But within seconds, everyone understood. This wasn't a routine audit. This was an investigation. And for the first time in his career, Jason wasn't the man controlling the room anymore. As the investigators entered his office, his personal cell phone began ringing. The screen displayed only one name, Melissa. He looked at it, then slowly pressed decline, because deep down, he already knew. The lie he'd spent years building had finally started to collapse. By the next morning, the news hadn't reached television. Not yet. Real investigations don't begin with reporters. They begin with locked doors, confiscated computers, and people who suddenly realize no one is answering their phone calls. Jason learned that lesson before breakfast. At 7:15 a.m., he arrived at corporate headquarters wearing the same confidence he'd worn every day for years. The parking garage gate opened automatically. The security guard nodded politely. Everything looked normal until he reached the executive floor. His access card flashed red. He frowned, tried again, axed. He looked toward the receptionist. There must be a mistake. She avoided eye contact. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole. The board instructed us not to grant executive access. My office is on that floor. I understand. But your credentials have been suspended." Jason laughed. Actually laughed. "Who authorized this?" Before she could answer, The elevator doors opened. 3 members of the board stepped out. None of them smiled. The chairman, Robert Henderson, spoke first. "Jason, we need to talk." Inside the conference room, every chair was occupied. Outside counsel, corporate compliance, 2 government investigators, the company's insurance representative. Vason looked around the room. "This seems excessive." Robert slid a folder across the table. "You've been accused of withholding mandatory workplace safety reports." Jason's didn't even open it. "That's ridiculous." Another folder appeared. "This contains emails recovered yesterday." Still, he didn't touch it. Instead, he leaned back. "Someone's trying to frame me." Robert remained calm. "Then you'll have no trouble explaining these." He pressed a remote. The conference room screen lit up. Jason's own email appeared. "Delay reporting until after the audit." Another email, "Steed draft copies before compliance reviews." Another, "No written discussions. Call me instead." Jason's confidence flickered for the first time. Only for a second. But everyone in the room saw it. Meanwhile, I was sitting beside Margaret's hospital bed. She was finally scheduled to return home the following afternoon. The physical therapist had helped her walk nearly 20 feet with a walker. She smiled proudly. "I beat yesterday." "You did. I'll beat tomorrow too. You always do." She laughed softly. "You know what? I still don't understand why someone would do this." I looked out the hospital window. "I don't think it was really about you," she frowned. "What do you mean?" "I think you became collateral damage." She didn't ask another question. Sometimes the truth is too heavy to carry all at once. My phone vibrated. David. "Richard, I'm listening. We've secured the servers." And Olivia told the truth. Every muscle in my body tightened. "How bad?" "Worse than we expected," he sighed. "There are 7 undocumented workplace injuries." I closed my eyes. 7. That's only what we've confirmed, he continued. "We've also found evidence that inspection reports were altered." And he paused. "Someone authorized electronic deletions from executive accounts." "Jason, we're verifying." His voice changed. "Richard, yes, I think your wife saved lives." I frowned. If Jason hadn't panicked after Sunday," David said quietly, "we might never have executed this search warrant." I looked toward Margaret. She was smiling at a little girl visiting the room across the hall, completely unaware that her suffering had already begun protecting families she'd never meet. Across town, Jason wasn't smiling anymore. The board meeting had entered its 3rd hour. Every explanation he'd offered had collapsed. It wasn't my responsibility. The investigators produced authorization logs. I don't remember approving that. They produced digital signatures. I delegated those reports. They produced witness statements. Every answer created another problem. Finally, Robert Henderson closed the last folder. "I have one question." Jason remained silent. Robert leaned forward. "Did you intentionally conceal workplace safety violations?" "No." Robert nodded. "Good." He pressed another button. The conference room door opened. A woman walked inside. Olivia. Jason's face turned white. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood 3 more employees. The maintenance supervisor Jason had fired, a compliance analyst, and a former operations manager who had resigned the previous year. One by one, they took seats along the wall. Jason stared at Olivia. "You." She met his eyes without flinching. "I'm done being afraid." The first witness spoke, then the second, then the third. Each story sounded different years, different projects, different locations. Yet everyone ended the same way. Jason ignored safety concerns. Employees who objected were threatened. Reports disappeared. People stayed silent because they needed their jobs. By lunchtime, no one in the room was questioning whether Jason had done it. The only question remaining was how long he'd been doing it. At exactly 1:43 p.m., Robert Henderson stood. "Jason Cole." His voice echoed through the silent conference room. "Effective immediately, you are terminated for cause." He placed a written resolution on the table. "Your executive compensation is suspended.
Your stock options are frozen.
Your access to company systems has been permanently revoked. Jason slowly stood. You can't do this. Robert looked directly into his eyes. No, he replied quietly. You did this. Two security officers stepped forward, not aggressively, professionally. Mr. Cole, we'll escort you out. Jason looked around the room one final time. The executives who once laughed at his jokes wouldn't meet his eyes. The employees who feared him didn't look frightened anymore. He had spent years believing power came from making other people afraid. Now he was the only frightened person in the room. That evening, Melissa knocked on my front door. She looked completely different. No makeup, red eyes, hair pulled back carelessly. She wasn't carrying her purse or her phone, just a thick folder held tightly against her chest. When I opened the door, she burst into tears. Dad, I didn't speak. She held the folder toward me with trembling hands. I found these hidden in Jason's home office. I looked down. Inside were copies of the government investigation notices, financial records, and something else. A photograph. It showed Jason shaking hands with executives at Harbor Point Construction. Standing only a few feet away was me, taken during the investigation 18 months before his first date with Melissa. I looked at the date stamped on the back, then at my daughter. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe. He knew, she whispered. He knew exactly who you were. Before he ever asked me out, I slowly closed the folder, and in that moment, the last piece of the puzzle finally fell into place. Jason hadn't just lied to our family. He had built his entire life on one enormous deception. And tomorrow, for the first time, he would have to answer for all of it. Melissa stood in my living room, unable to stop crying. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. She simply stared at the photograph in her trembling hands. I've looked at this picture 100 times today. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I still keep hoping I'm wrong. I gently took the photograph from her. It had been taken 18 months before their first date. There I was, standing beside Harbor Point executives after one of the final inspection meetings. And there, almost hidden behind two project managers, was Jason, watching me. Not smiling, not speaking, just watching. You didn't know him then, Melissa asked. I shook my head.
No, but he knew you.
Yes. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Melissa slowly sat down on the couch. I keep replaying everything. The first date, the engagement, the wedding. She covered her face. I don't even know what's real anymore. I sat beside her. Your feelings were real. She looked at me through tear-filled eyes. But his? I couldn't answer because I didn't know, and I wasn't going to comfort her with a lie. She wiped her face. There's something else. She reached into the folder again. I found a notebook. She handed it to me. Black leather, no company logo, no initials, just dates, hundreds of them. Every page contained short handwritten notes, meetings, names, deadlines, pawn calls. At first, nothing unusual. Then I reached the page dated almost 2 years earlier, the week Jason first met Melissa. One sentence caught my eye. Dinner with Melissa. Learn more about Hayes' family. I turned another page. Richard retired. Good timing. Another. Need to stay close. Avoid unnecessary attention. My hands tightened around the notebook. This wasn't love. This was strategy. Melissa broke down again. I married a man who kept notes about my family. No, she corrected herself before I could speak. I married a man who studied my family. I reached for her hand. This isn't your fault. She shook her head violently. I should have seen it. You couldn't. I ignored Ethan. What do you mean? He told me Jason was changing. I said he was jealous. She closed her eyes, and Mom, her voice cracked. Mom defended him every single time. Before I could answer, my phone rang. David, we've got him. I stood immediately. What happened? He tried to leave. Leave where? The airport. I frowned. I thought his passport had been flagged. It was. He never got through security. I looked at Melissa. She already knew. Her shoulders slumped. She whispered. He was running. David continued. We need you downtown. Why? Jason's asking for you. I almost laughed. His attorney know you. He specifically requested Richard Hayes. Did he say why? David paused. Only one sentence. What was it? He deserves to hear it from me. 45 minutes later, I walked into the interview room. Jason looked nothing like the confident executive I'd met at family dinners. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His tie had been removed. Dark circles surrounded his eyes. For the first time, he looked ordinary. The investigator nodded toward the empty chair. He asked to speak with you alone. I sat down. The door closed behind me for nearly 30 seconds. Neither of us spoke, finally. Jason laughed, a tired, broken laugh. You really couldn't let it go. I looked at him calmly. You tripped my wife. I know. No denial. Just those 2 words. I know. He leaned back. You want to know the funny part? I didn't answer. I never meant to hurt her that badly. There it was. Not. I didn't do it. Not. It was an accident. Instead, he admitted intent, only arguing about the result. You admit you did it. He looked at me. She was supposed to stumble, be embarrassed. That's all. My jaw tightened. You planned it. He smiled bitterly. I planned to distract you. Everything became perfectly still. What? You were asking questions. About Harbour Point, about old inspections. I heard you'd contacted Daniel Foster. So he had been watching me. Jason rubbed both hands over his face. I knew once you started digging, everything would come apart. So you hurt Margaret. I needed you focused on your family. He looked directly at me. I underestimated you. No, I replied quietly. You underestimated her. He frowned. What? My wife survived. She remembered. She refused to hate. And because of that, I leaned forward. You lost everything. Jason laughed again. You think this ends with me? Those words immediately caught my attention. What does that mean? His smile disappeared. I'm not the only one. I stayed silent. The board knew. Some investors knew. People above me signed those reports. Interesting, very interesting. Then why protect them? I wasn't. He looked toward the table. They stopped protecting me yesterday. For the first time, I almost felt sorry for him, almost. He had spent years believing loyalty could be bought. Now he was discovering the truth. The people who help you hide crimes are usually the first people to sacrifice you. He looked at me one final time. I did love Melissa. I held his gaze. I believe you. His eyes widened. But you loved protecting yourself more. He lowered his head, and for the first time since I'd met him, he had no response. Not because he'd run out of lies, because the truth had finally cornered him. As I stood to leave, Jason spoke one last sentence. You know, I stopped at the door. If your wife hadn't fallen, he whispered, I'd still be free. I looked back at him. No, I said quietly. You'd just have had a little more time. Then I walked out behind me. The door closed with a heavy metallic click. For Jason, it sounded like the end. For my family, it was finally the beginning of healing. 3 months later, Margaret walked into our backyard without her walker. She moved slowly, carefully, but she walked. I stood on the porch pretending to trim the roses she'd planted years ago. The truth was, I wasn't trimming anything. I was watching my wife reclaim her life. One careful step at a time. She looked up and smiled. I caught me doing what? Worrying. I wasn't worried. She laughed. You've been married to me for 43 years. I know exactly what your worried face looks like. Maybe she did. After everything we'd survived, there wasn't much left we could hide from each other. The investigation had spread far beyond Jason. Within 6 weeks, state investigators partnered with federal workplace safety officials and financial crime prosecutors. The evidence recovered from Olivia's flash drive led to search warrants at multiple corporate offices. Imam's servers were seized. Financial records were examined. Former employees finally came forward. 1 witness became 5. 5 became 17. 17 became dozens. The pattern investigators suspected turned out to be much larger than anyone imagined. Companies had quietly hidden serious workplace injuries. Safety inspections had been delayed. Reports had been altered. Executives had signed documents they later claimed they'd never seen. The system Jason thought would protect him collapsed under the weight of its own lies. Olivia entered witness protection during the early stages of the case. Before she left, she sent me one final handwritten letter. It arrived without a return address. Inside was only a single page. Mr. Hayes, for 3 years I believed speaking the truth would cost me everything. I was wrong. Staying silent almost did. Thank you for answering the phone when no one else would, Olivia. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my desk drawer, not as evidence, as a reminder. Sometimes courage begins with one frightened voice. Melissa moved into a small apartment across town. The divorce proceedings began quietly. She never asked me to hate Jason for her. She never defended him again either. One Sunday afternoon, she sat beside Margaret in the garden. "I'm sorry." Margaret looked confused. "For what?" "For bringing him into our lives." Margaret reached over and took her daughter's hand. "My sweet girl," she smiled gently. "You married the man he pretended to be." Melissa broke down, crying. Margaret pulled her into a hug. "You don't owe us an apology." "He does." For the first time in months, I saw a little peace return to Melissa's face. Ethan became the unexpected hero of our family. He visited every weekend, helped Margaret with physical therapy, fixed things around the house that I stubbornly insisted didn't need fixing. One evening, while repairing our fence, he looked at me and smiled. "You know what? I'm glad I finally told you what I saw. I put another board into place." "So am I." I almost stayed quiet. "I know," he looked down. I would have regretted that forever. I rested a hand on his shoulder. "The hardest truth to tell," I said quietly, "is usually the one someone desperately needs to hear." He nodded. Neither of us said another word. We didn't need to. 4 months after Margaret's fall, David called again. "You busy?" "Never too busy for you." He laughed. "I thought you'd want to know." "What?" The grand jury returned its decision. I remained silent. "They're moving forward against Jason." Jason, he paused, and 6 other executives. I closed my eyes, not because I felt victorious, because I felt relieved. Justice wasn't revenge. Justice was accountability. There was a difference. A few weeks later, I received one final request. Jason wanted to see me. Again this time, I almost declined. Then Margaret surprised me. "You should go." "You really think so?" She nodded. "Not for him. For yourself." She was right. As usual, the meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Jason looked thinner, older. The confidence that once filled every room he entered was gone. He didn't ask about the investigation. He already knew. He didn't ask about Melissa. He knew she'd filed for divorce. Instead, he asked only one question. "Why didn't you just hate me?" I looked at him for a long moment. Then I answered honestly. "Because hate would have made me stop thinking." He frowned. "I don't understand. I spent 40 years investigating people. The angry investigators missed evidence. The patient ones found it." He lowered his eyes. "You really made only one phone call?" I nodded. He laughed quietly. "I thought you'd come after me." "I did." He looked confused. "I came after the truth." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Jason whispered, "I destroyed my own life." I nodded. "You did. Not when he was arrested, not when he lost his career, not when Melissa left him. He destroyed it the moment he decided that hurting innocent people was easier than telling the truth." That choice had simply taken years to catch up with him. I stood and walked toward the door. "Richard." I stopped. "I'm sorry." I looked back at him. For the first time since I'd known him, there was no manipulation in his voice, no performance, only regret. I answered with the only words that felt true. "I hope one day you become the kind of man who actually understands what that word means." Then I left. I never saw him again. A year later, Margaret and I returned to the same restaurant where we'd celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary. She walked beside me without assistance, a little slower than before. but with the same smile I'd fallen in love with 44 years earlier. As dessert arrived, she looked across the table. "What are you thinking about?" I smiled. "That life changes faster than we expect." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. And I looked into her eyes. But character never does. Outside, people hurried past the restaurant, chasing deadlines, meetings, and ambitions inside. I realized something I wished I'd understood years earlier. Strength isn't measured by how hard you hit back. It's measured by whether you can protect the people you love without becoming like the person who hurt them. Jason believed power came from controlling others. He lost everything because of it. Margaret believed kindness made people stronger, even after everything she'd endured. She proved she was right. And as we walked out into the evening together, I understood the greatest victory wasn't watching a guilty man lose his career. It was walking beside the woman he failed to break. Before you go, I'd like to ask you something. If someone deliberately hurt the person you loved most, would you seek revenge, or would you let the truth deliver justice? Richard made just one phone call. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. He didn't take the law into his own hands. He trusted that the truth, when backed by evidence, is stronger than anger. Do you think he made the right choice? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them, and your perspective might inspire the next story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Every week, I bring you powerful stories about family, betrayal, justice, and second chances. Until next time, take care of the people who truly love you, because trust takes years to build, but only one moment to destroy.